You're listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House.
Welcome, I'm Juan de Lara, Cultural Manager at Asia House, and this is our second episode of Arts in Isolation, the digital program that Asia House has tailored to help and alleviate this time of isolation and confinement. So thank you all of you who have listened to our first episode last week with Benicia Porter, which by the way received amazing feedback, so we're very thankful for your enthusiasm. And today's episode is part of Converging in partnership with Barakat Trust, which is made possible with the kind support of the Altair Trust and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And in case you're not familiar with our program, Converging Paths aim to foster cross-cultural understanding, building bridges, and raise awareness with the many cultures that form the Islamic world. And today we're glad to bring you a conversation in between two of the people I have the utmost respect for on how can we learn from the past, which is a topic that is particularly relevant during these times. For this, I have with me Professor Nasser Rabbat and Saif al-Rashidi. Nasser Rabbat is the Aga Khan Professor and Director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT. He's a prolific writer, columnist, and is the author of several books, including many on the history of Egypt and Syria. And he contributes to several newspapers and magazines on culture and political culture. Saif al-Rashidi is currently the director of the Barakat Trust. He recently co-authored The Tent Makers of Cairo and has worked on the Salisbury Cathedral and the Durham World Heritage Sites. Well, thank you both of you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. And Nasser, it's very nice to have you with us, even though both in isolation, miles and miles away from each other.
3,200 to be precise.
Okay. Well, I always imagine that for academics, isolation might be the dream opportunity to do amazing creative things and produce new work. And I hope that you find it inspiring in some ways, Nasser.
I mean, of course, like everyone else who's in isolation and whose métier is to write and read, I'm finding the isolation an opportunity to write. But of course, I do not want to give isolation any credit because it is somewhat also destroying some of the social fabrics that we have worked for in many years, friends and relatives and seeing people. So I don't want to really give social isolation any undue positive notions, even though I, like many other academics, are benefiting from it.
Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I wanted to ask you primarily, I mean, as a historian, how do you think that history is relevant and the study of history is relevant to us today, especially at a time when there's so many current things going on?
You know, traditionally, historians, both in the Islamic world and in the Western world, used to think that history is basically teaching us lessons about how to behave both individually and collectively, both as a society and as individuals. Of course, modern history has dropped this kind of claim, and historians today emphasize the point that we study history to learn about the past. And they do not necessarily push the argument in the direction of learning about the past helps us think about the present and the future, which of course it does, even though it's not a one-on-one relationship, because historians today do emphasize the difference between the conditions of the past, which do not repeat. You know, that famous saying attributed to Hegel about sort of like the past repeats itself, and then Marx comes in and adds the first time as a tragedy, the second time as a farce. So in a way, history does not repeat itself, and I'm of that opinion. But at the same time, history does teach us a lot of lessons about how we can face up to challenges. As many historians have written about the fact of society's main role is to face up to challenges, both to its own survival and the survival of the individual. The problem, to tell you the truth, is that most of our political leadership today does not learn from history or does not care for history. There are so many things that could have been learned from recent history or far back history that have not been learned. There are so many reports and writings that are coming out from historians that warning about our reaction to the crisis, not about the crisis itself, and about how societies in the past who have failed to take certain measures have paid a heavier price. And yet, of course, no one is listening in a way on the decision-making level, especially in the two respective countries where we are, the United States and the United Kingdom. The leadership does not seem to be learning from history.
I mean, can you give us examples of things that we could learn from?
Well, I mean, some of the examples, of course, have become now so widely reported. The one thing that, for example, is a very glaring issue is social isolation and the idea of trying to prevent people from mixing. And there has been now stories circulating about how different American cities have reacted to the Spanish flu in the 1918-1919 epidemic. And that at the end of the First World War, Philadelphia carried on with its plan to have a major celebration of the end of the war, and it immediately witnessed a spike in cases of Spanish flu and in death. And St. Louis did the exact opposite. They sort of delayed all sorts of celebrations, and at the same time, they tried to prevent people from mixing in public spaces, and their cases were much lower than Philadelphia. This is now actually in the public realm. Everyone is reading about it. And this could have been used by both leaderships here and in the United Kingdom, which actually did not do it. This is something that is just 100 years old. One could go back in time to also sort of social isolation. And perhaps if one goes into some of the major pandemics in history and looks at their details, you would see that the differences in victim numbers and in cases numbers really depended very much on how cities and counties and countries took measures about separating people, about de-densifying the presence of people in public spaces.
Well, thank you. Can you tell us, I mean, offhand, can you think of any examples from the Islamic world or the period that you study that somehow capture the same spirit?
Actually, of the unwise, I want to use the examples from the Islamic world to underline a very important point. Plagues and pandemics in general are democratic. In a sense, they usually do not distinguish between rich and poor, powerful and feeble, proletariat and nobility. They hit anyone. But pandemics and plagues in history have been extremely class-oriented in the way humanity has responded to them. So you would realize that the people, of course, that pay the heaviest price in history are the poor, the downtrodden, the people who have to work, the people who cannot afford not being in very crowded places or who are forced to be in very crowded places. Say, for example, today, construction workers in very wealthy countries that are still forced to work on construction and mix together, and most probably a lot of them are catching the COVID-19. So in history, what we learn from history is that the rich always understood the importance of social isolation. And therefore, if you look at histories of major cities during the age of plague, and I'll give you examples from both sides, but Florence and Rome from the Renaissance and the Baroque period, and Cordoba and Damascus from the Islamic period, were cities that witnessed the building of the largest numbers of villas, to use the European name for them, or munyas, to use the Islamic name for them, during the period of plague. Basically what happens is that the rich leave the city and go and live in their villa rustica, in their countryside house, in order to isolate themselves and survive the plague. Whereas the poor that are in the crowded and unhygienic cities pay a very, very heavy price. There has been writing about that, of course, but from the perspective of a historian of architecture, which I am, we have to recognize that when we celebrate and, in a sense, speak very positively about the beauty of the villas in the countryside, that they came as a result of social distinction between those who can afford living outside of the city and those who cannot. I mean, the large royal city of Madinat al-Zahra is a result of a fear of pandemics. And a lot of the Umayyad palaces in the late 7th, early 8th century were actually also the result of the realization of the ruling class in Greater Syria that the cities are crowded and that the plague moves much faster in that sense. To move to another example, just to speak about examples of history, the Black Death, the Great Plague of 1348, 1349, we don't know, of course, because there were no statistics, but wiped out between 1/3 and 1/2 of humanity. And that resulted in huge geopolitical changes. It is believed that the Mamluk Empire, for example, never recovered from the Black Death of 1348, and therefore it actually weakened it to the point of no return. So it was to be swallowed 150 years later by the Ottomans. Of course, actually, it's impossible to connect two events across 150 years, but the economy of the Mamluks was actually tethering all the way between the middle of the 14th century and the early 16th century. And clearly, the Black Death has caused irreversible reduction in population and enabled population to take care of the agriculture in Egypt. In terms of architecture, you probably know that the inheritance laws in the Islamic environment in Mamluk Egypt has resulted in a concentration of more wealth of people who died without heirs because the money was decided to go to the ruling class, or more specifically to the Sultan, and that has given us something as magnificent as the Mosque of Sultan Hassan, which was built in 1356-61, right after the Black Death. Otherwise, of course, historians have puzzled at the little historical analysis in the chroniclers of the period about the effect of the Black Death. I mean, they do report sort of like exaggerated numbers about who died and how many countrysides or how much of the countryside was left unattended and untended. But we don't have that much information specifically in relationship to how much information we have about what happened in the Italian city-states or in the larger communities in Europe, especially in Spain and in France, about which we have much more information.
But how, I mean, moments like these must have shaped and changed the ways societies thought. I mean,
absolutely.
How did events like the Black Death lead to shifts in society, and do you think we should expect to see the same today?
Yeah, I think actually, I mean, social dynamics, of course, vary from time to time. And of course, today we have to take into account the fact that technology has redefined our social spaces. So it's very difficult to compare between pre-technological connectivity and the age in which we live. But there are few other social and political phenomena, and as a matter of fact, for that matter, of course, urban and architectural phenomena that have been heavily influenced by the Black Death, but also by other plagues, because of course humanity have witnessed so many other plagues, and we can start listing them, and a lot of them are repeating today. One is a return to piety, and you could see it from the way people have become much more fearful, if you want, of the wrath of God after the Black Death, and you see it from nursery rhymes in Europe to writing in religious texts and more sort of like popular or para-religious texts in the Islamic world. You see it, of course, also from the rise of religious building immediately after the plague. The Sultan Hassan is a very imposing example in Egypt, but there are many smaller religious structures. We even start seeing in the Mamluk period that people who normally did not endow religious structures, namely the great merchants or traders or the high-level chancery scribes and officials, they started endowing buildings after this rather than basically giving their money to other causes. after their death. So, and the other point, which I actually am coming back to it, and I want to emphasize it again, is that plagues shows the inequality in our social structures. Because, as I said, plague is democratic. Our reaction to the plague is very much class-oriented. And this has been the case repeatedly in all the examples in the past. Now, on the positive side, the realization of contagion and of proximity has led to some of the new principles of urban planning, not in the Islamic world, I have to say, but in Europe. And you could see it in the planning of the small cities that Florence was building around itself during the 15th, 16th century, that are all sort of like orthogonal in planning. The streets are wide. There is always attention being paid to keeping houses far from each other. So the humanity is learning from the effect of the social structure on the degree of the spread of the plague, and it's reacting through new urban planning principles. Of course, it takes few centuries for it to become sort of like textbook urban planning, but the idea of open spaces, the idea of greenery, the idea of allowing the sunshine to reach as much urban spaces as possible, all of that is learned from the plague and the heavy price that plagues have exacted on society across history.
And do you think we should expect the same today?
One would hope so, but again, as I was saying, I mean, I do not think that history repeats itself. We learn in a way from the mistakes of the past, but sometimes we learn from them only anecdotally. We do not learn from them constructively, and that's a real problem. And the other thing is, as I was saying, we do not know as historians, and it's probably very difficult to judge whether it is possible to apply some of the lessons of the past on our technological age. Again, I mean, today the tools in our hands are very different. I mean, I would say radically, drastically different than the tools in the hand of the past, both in terms of our biological knowledge and in terms of our technology of communication and connection, and perhaps actually remote construction and so on. So yes, there are lessons to be learned, and it seems to me that the most important lesson to be learned is the popularization or the spreading of public health system. We have to learn from the past that responses that have been class-oriented were, first of all, unjust. And of course, we have a much more heightened sense of injustice today. And at the same time, we're actually counterproductive, even from an economic viewpoint, because in some instances, it wiped out whole sections of the economy. I mean, in Damascus, my native city, there had been examples in serious calamities. Some of them were man-made. I will speak the Tamerlane invasion in the year 1399, the year 1400. After that, Damascus, which was famous for so many crafts, there are some crafts that actually went extinct. And that changed even the image of the city and changed, of course, actually the production of the city and what the city was famous for. So do we learn from that? I hope so. I hope we have wise political leadership that can learn from that. In previous administration in the United States, there used to be historians that were in prominent positions as advisors to the president. As far as I know, in the current administration, there are no historians. There is no one whose main area of expertise is to look at the past and give examples of lessons to be heard or learned from the past.
Was it a convention? I mean, was it until a certain point that there were historian advisors, or was it sporadic?
I think it was personal, but I think it has to do with the degree of the education of the president in most instances. I mean, we did have prominent historians in the presidency of Kennedy, of course, and we did have prominent historians in the presidency of George Bush the father. So you could imagine that it depends on the kind of education that they received and whether they have the kind of education that is now under attack, which is the liberal art education, the humanities-oriented education. I think these individuals have been exposed to probably prep schools with a humanity orientation and went to liberal art colleges for their undergraduate education. We know they went to, of course, prime schools, and perhaps this is where they learned the importance of having a historian around. We even actually had a historian who was rather a destructive character in the history of the United States. Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House, was actually a history professor.
And we've been talking a lot about leadership. Can you bring to mind any anecdote or incident of remarkable leadership, perhaps from your own academic background of the Islamic world?
You mean in times of crisis?
Yes.
The answer is no, I cannot. I actually, as an individual, I'm someone who's wary of leadership in times of crisis. And that's actually something very psychological. Crisis sort of like challenge us to speak about our own mortality and perhaps about the survival of those who we consider to be essential. And leadership has proven across history that it really didn't care about the masses of people. And of course, pre-18th century, the masses of people were considered to be subjects, disposable. So we cannot really blame them for that because this is how they saw all of their subjects. But post-human rights and civic rights and so on, leadership does speak about the importance of everyone, about some sort of like a public concern. But leadership has not really changed its own behavior. Leadership still thinks about the benefit and the survival of its own supporting class. And in most instances, of course, it's the rich class in most countries. So no, I do not have trust in leadership, not in the past and not in the present.
One of the things and one of the reasons we are very keen to have a chat is that what you just demonstrated, you're a historian and an art historian, but many of your concerns and your writings are indeed about society and culture and politics. And I wondered what your current or upcoming projects were, and if you could tell us a bit about some of the things you're doing that are personally meaningful to you.
Well, I should say that my reaction to the current crisis has not been like corresponding to the crisis itself. I am involved in so many projects that started before the current crisis, and some of them are motivated by my sense of loss in other tragedies. One of the projects that I'm working on, and I am about to sign the contract with the publisher, is a book on the cultural history of Syria, for which I have managed to gather 27 scholars who work on Syria to cover the history of Syria from the Seleucid period, namely the 3rd century BCE, all the way down to the present. And the main argument of the book is that the history of Syria, or at least the history of Syrian material culture, art and architecture mostly, is a history of multiculturalism. This is a way to counter in the abyss into which Syria had fallen of becoming a country of severe sectarian and ethnic and religious and class distinctions. And in a way of saying, history tells us that the place was much more multicultural, much more compassionate, much more open-minded, and let's look at how the art expressed that. So this is one of the projects that I'm working on now. Another project that I'm planning to start with, for which I also have a contract, but I don't know when I will start with it, is a history of medieval Cairo. And the history of medieval Cairo would, of course, actually spend some time looking at the period after the Black Deaths, but that's too early for me to tell you that whether the COVID-19 pandemic is going to affect how I'm going to treat the 14th century calamity. I have a project on a 15th century historian, which I'm hoping that I will be able to finish it, the book on Al-Maqrizi, the main historian of the city of Cairo, and I would say one of the major medieval Islamic historians. And in the case of Al-Maqrizi, to me, he is an extremely attractive figure because in an age in which there was no political criticism to speak of, he is one of the few people, and I would actually say he is the most prominent political critique of the age of the Mamluks. And this is what my book will try to show. Al-Maqrizi was motivated to write history by a small calamity of the year 1406, and which actually was a plague and a famine together. And according to Al-Maqrizi, the mismanagement of the leadership of his time, the Mamluks that is, has led to this calamity becoming irrevocable. And this is what motivated him to start saying, and therefore I am going to write the history of Egypt, because I want to preserve the memories of the glory days, and at the same time I want to point out to the difficulties of the calamitous days and how the current leadership is failing to react. And from his perspective, earlier leadership have reacted much better, but the calamities that he is interested in are really not the natural ones. He is much more interested in political and military calamities and invasions and so on. So to me, this is probably the most important project I'm working on. And again, going back to Syria, I'm co-editing a book with a former postdoc with us here in the Aga Khan program. We organized a conference under the title Reconstruction as Violence, and we are looking, in a sense, the holes in arguments for reconstruction regardless of the outcome of civil wars or of social disruption. And we are emphasizing the point that political solutions have to precede the large urban reconstruction that people speak about. And the example that we are focusing on in that book is the city of Aleppo in Syria. And I continue working on my, journalistic work, and I basically write articles that are much more connected to the present. So perhaps a little bit of what I'm expressing in this interview would transpire in the newspaper articles I write. An article every 15 days under some sort of a contract with the Qatar-based newspaper Al Arabi Jadid, the New Arab. So this is where perhaps I would express some of my concerns about the moment.
And I think, one final thing I wanted to ask you about, which is education and the fact that you're at MIT, one of the leading institutions in the world. At moments like this, I mean, even teaching has changed, the way you're using online teaching and everything else. And do you think that this will pave a new way for education and new forms of techniques of education? And what do you look forward to in that respect?
Well, I have to say that I am an extremely privileged individual, both in terms of where I teach and in terms of who I teach. So my observations are extremely skewed because I have superior students, I have very few students, and I have a lot of resources at my disposal. So from my perspective, the move to the online education has not changed the personal quality of the education. I am still meeting with my students because I have about 20 of them. So I'm still meeting with my students on a one-on-one basis. I'm spending an hour with each one of these students to talk about their research project. So in a sense, the mass education that was promised by the MOOC movement a couple of years ago has not really washed over my own approach to education. And to me, the online education is still providing that. So I cannot speak for people who have classes of hundreds of people where the education is moving more and more toward the unpersonal or impersonal, and more toward mass education. I'm not a believer in that, but I'm also someone who's very well aware of how expensive education is, and therefore, in order to democratize education, we might have to somehow create mass education tools like what we see in now, of online-based courses and meetings over Zoom and so on and so forth. Whether this is going to change the privileged higher education system in the West, which is what the system that produces most leaders in all fields, science and humanities and politics and social science. I actually do not think so. Again, this goes back to my point about the social distinctions are heightened rather than lessened. So even though technology is probably providing us with tools to iron out the differences, we will come out of it with, again, the same notion of more personal education available to the few, and perhaps the technology would allow us to reach larger numbers for a lower kind of education.
You have a teenage son, right?
Yes.
Just summing up or thinking about the current situation in a few words, what advice would you give your son as a lesson to learn from it? Not necessarily don't go out and don't see your friends, but for the future.
It's actually very difficult to articulate a lesson for the future, given the fact that we don't know what the future is going to look like. And I am on a more pessimistic side about the future. But I am divided between two, is that try to be your best so that you are on the leading end of the social spectrum in the future, which somehow clashes with my own political beliefs. And the other is actually to be more compassionate and more aware of the basis or of the root cause of social distinction, which is economic disparity. Literally, really, what I want this calamity to teach the new generation is the need of the affluent and the haves to help the have-nots becoming like them, rather than to dismiss them. I mean, like them in terms of their ability to navigate social restriction and their ability to succeed and their ability to live a fulfilling life. And that requires really the implementation of much, much, much larger publicly oriented systems than we have in the current system. I find it extremely, to me at least, extremely insulting when the political discourse in the US dismisses socialism as something that Americans are not ready for, when all the indications around us is that some sort of a social health system would have saved a lot of the problems that we have today in the US.
Thank you. I hope that people learn and people reflect in the way that you suggest, and that we'll come out of it with positive lessons and a more equitable and fair society, or society.
And more humanistic. I am actually still a stickler of the notion of humanism, despite all the battering that it has received from the time of Immanuel Kant all the way down to the present.
I hope so.
Well, thank you both for the most stimulating talk. I think right now a lot of people out there are looking for answers, particularly amidst a situation of uncertainty. Of course, we don't have them, but what we're trying here is to give you some tools to untangle the future and reflect by ourselves on what is necessary for us to thrive as human beings. Safe, thank you so much. I think I will see you at Asia House as soon as this isolation process is over. And Nasser, it has been a true privilege. Please, I hope that you can come to London and join us at Asia House, and of course to be part of Converging Paths as soon as you can.
I would look forward to that. I hope so.
Thank you all of our listeners. This event has been a special request from many of you, so please feel free to contact me if there is someone in particular you want us to approach and talk to. Stay tuned to our website and sign up to receive our newsletters so you don't ever miss an episode, and you will have received some more content such as access to special movies and music. See you all next week. Take care and stay safe.
You were listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House. For more information, please visit our website, asiahousearts.org.